Welcome back to Intro to Philosophy 1010. This is our book, Introduction to World Philosophy. And in this video, we are going over the Lankavatara Sutra. So this is the Mahayana Buddhist text. And the exam questions for exam 4 that we're going over are two questions in part B. The first is exam question number 3 for part B. Do you think the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of being a Bodhisattva, as described in chapter 1.5, undermines or strengthens the Buddhist philosophy of no self, anatta, described in chapters 7 and 8? Explain. And then part B, question 4, how is a Bodhisattva similar to the prisoner in Plato's cave allegory who has seen the sun? And for that part 4 question, I'm going to read part of the cave allegory in Plato's Republic that goes just past what's included in our book. So if you choose that question, you'll need to refer to this video for more information, although most of it is included in this section in our book. Okay, so does the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of a Bodhisattva undermine or strengthen the idea of no self that we went over? So to make matters easier, now let me go back to this camera, which likes to blink off on me. I'm going to just focus on the questions to King Milinda. That was in chapter 7, and it's page 224, the questions to King Milinda, and that's the chariot analogy. So, and I put up a video about that when we went over that in the first quarter of our mini semester here in the summer. So just to overview it from my head to keep this video going. So King Milinda, the Greek king in the town of Bactria, which is in current-day Afghanistan. It's where the Greek Empire met India. It was a Buddhist town, and the monk Nagasena was there, and the king, Milinda, asked him, "Who are you?" The monk said, "I am Nagasena," but that's just a name. Really, there's no self. And then the king said, "What do you mean there's no self? If there's no self, then who am I giving money to help give medicines for the poor? Who am I arresting for murder? Who's been murdered? No one's been murdered. There's no murderer. It doesn't make any sense." Rather than answer those questions, Nagasena just says, "Did you come on a chariot or did you walk? Because I know you didn't walk because your feet are weak because you're raised in a royal household." So he insults him a little bit, and then he gets the king to admit, "Yes, I took a chariot. A chariot, is it the wheels? Is it the axle? Is it the flagpole? No, it's none of those. Is it all those parts put together? No, the chariot is just a word referring to a bunch of different parts that are temporarily assembled. There is no chariot. There's no single enduring thing called a chariot. And similarly, there's no single enduring thing called a self." So that's the Buddhist philosophy of no self. The idea of a bodhisattva is someone who is right on the cusp of achieving Buddhahood, but rather than merge back into nirvana, this impersonal bliss, that person, but there's no person. See, so this is why I put the question this way, has compassion for all other selves or suffering, temporary, illusory selves, and refuses to go into nirvana until everyone is freed. So the question is, does compassion for others, a selfless compassion for others, it seems to be, oh, there's no self, I have total selfless compassion for others, but that implies that you have compassion for other selves. Is there a self? Is there no self? The Mahayana philosophy seems to push that question to the forefront. So I'll read a little bit here on page 25 of our book. The southern branch of Buddhism, sometimes known by the name of the Theravada philosophy, rests its conception of virtue on that of the southern canon. Its ideal is to become an arhat, a saint, also called a pratyeka Buddha, one who loses all individuality in universal, impersonal bliss, nirvana. The northern branch of Buddhism, Mahayana Buddhism, recognizes a distinct and later literature as sacred, its ideal is the Bodhisattva, one whose essence is enlightenment, who, unlike the Arhat, turns back from the final bliss to help others. To achieve nirvana is no longer the ideal, but rather to be enlightened and attain a perfect form. All right, so the idea of no self, there's no chariot, there's no self, there's no form, there's no enduring any single thing. Nothing endures from one moment to the next. There's just a constant flux of sense perceptions, emotions, and thoughts and desires. They come and they go. There's no unity underlying them all. So the idea of trying to achieve a perfect form, that's a lot more like Plato's philosophy and the Hindu philosophy, where the individual soul is striving to perceive the absolute forms of knowledge, and with the Hindus is to return to the spiritual planets where your spiritual body, your eternal form is waiting, and that these material bodies are just like dream reflections of your eternal, true spiritual form. And the Mahayana Buddhism talks a lot about these super terrestrial forms or bodies you can acquire. Now, I'm no expert in Buddhism. I'm no expert in, you could argue I'm not an expert in anything if I don't know the original languages that these philosophers write in. But I've read a lot more of Hinduism and Plato and Nietzsche, for example, than I have of the Buddhist texts, but still reading enough of it to get a sense of Buddhism. The Mahayana Buddhism seems to come a lot closer to Hinduism. And that's the question. By answering that question, it just makes you think of both of these alternative forms of Buddhism. And so I will now continue to read a little bit of, I think this is a nice image on page 26, the story to demonstrate the difference between Mahayana Buddhism and Theravada Buddhism. So there's 4 travelers in the desert about to collapse of thirst. They find what appears to be an oasis, but there's a high wall above it. So the first one goes over, they say, oh, I'll look, and if I see something, I'll call back and tell you. First one goes over, doesn't call back, never comes back. Second one does the same thing. The third one looks over the edge of the wall, says, oh yeah, there's water here. There is an oasis here. So come on. So the fourth guy goes up, climbs the wall, and he says, come on, let's go. But the third guy says, no, I'm going back in the desert, and I'll try to find others who are lost. I'll point them towards the oasis. So that is the Bodhisattva. Rather than just merge in the impersonal bliss of nirvana and lose all suffering, the Bodhisattva agrees to stay in the realm of material bodies and karma and reincarnation to help everybody else out. And that's looking for the good of others. But again, is that really staying true to the no-self philosophy? Over on page 27 in the bottom of page 27. So the Theravada Buddhist, however, has a response to this ideal. Actually, I'll read the paragraph just above that. The Mahayana wisdom literature thus puts forward a conception of virtue that, while distinctly Buddhist, resembles Christian virtues in many ways. The Bodhisattva sacrifices the quest for his own good to seek the good of others. The Theravada Buddhist, however, has a response to this ideal. One could argue that the ethical ideal of the Bodhisattva undermines itself. If the Bodhisattva helps others toward nirvana, he or she, in effect, helps them to become arhats, not bodhisattvas. So the good Bodhisattva will teach Theravada, not Mahayana Buddhism. And then from a Mahayana perspective, this response falls into a trap. To achieve enlightenment, one must eliminate cravings, selfish desires, including the desire for nirvana. The best way to lead people to enlightenment, therefore, is to teach them the Bodhisattva ideal. Teaching them to be arhats encourages them to subjugate most desires to a desire for nirvana, not to eliminate desire itself. Okay, but then I think a Theravada Buddhist could respond, well, all right, we're desiring nirvana, but you're desiring the welfare of others. So that's a double mistake, because you have desire and you have a conception of other selves, which seems to violate the no-self philosophy. Now, I know when we read through this, they repeat, there is no self, there is no ego. But then that seems to be contradicted by the entire focus of helping others. So that's the question you'll need to address in this question for part B. What is it? Question 3 and 4. So question 3, do you think the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of being a Bodhisattva undermines or strengthens the Buddhist philosophy of no self, described in chapter 7 and 8? So it's just Indian Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism, the basic philosophy is the same. There is no enduring unit of being anywhere, be it material or spiritual. There's no self. So does the idea of compassion for others violate that philosophy? All right, so I will now read just a few selections from the Lankavatara Sutra. So Mahamati is a bodhisattva, and he's talking to Buddha. So I'll just begin here on page 27. Then said Mahamati to the Blessed One, will you tell us now about the disciples who are bodhisattvas? The Blessed One replied, the bodhisattvas are those earnest disciples who are enlightened by reason of their efforts to attain self-realization of noble wisdom, and who have taken upon themselves the task to enlighten others. They have gained a clear understanding of the truth that all things are empty, unborn, and of a Maya-like illusory nature. They have ceased from viewing things discriminatively and from considering them in their relations. They thoroughly understand the truth of twofold egolessness and have adjusted themselves to it with patient acceptance. They have attained a definite realization of imagelessness, and they are abiding in the perfect knowledge that they have gained by self-realization of noble wisdom. So every time I see the word self-realization, to me that seems to violate the idea of no self. Unless you're considering self-realization to be the realization that there is no self. And yet, each of these bodhisattvas achieves a form. So bodhisattvas go through 10 levels of enlightenment. And I think that's similar to the 8 stages of enlightenment that Buddha went through while sitting under the tree of enlightenment. So I will read a little bit here just to put some context in this. So here's the book for the College of Southern Maryland for the Intro to Religion or World Religions, Anthology of World Religions. So I teach this class also, and I will, on page 171 of this book, the Enlightenment. So this comes from the Buddha Charita, and Buddha's sitting under a tree. This is where he has his Buddha enlightenment. And it says here, in the first watch of the night, he recollected the successive series of his former births. There was I, so-and-so. That was my name. Deceased from there, I came here. And in this way, he remembered thousands of births, as though living them over again. When he had recalled his own births and deaths and all these various lives of his, the sage, full of pity, turned his compassionate mind toward other living beings, and he thought to himself, again and again they must leave the people they regard as their own. So he realized all of his own former reincarnations, and that made him have overwhelming pity for everyone else suffering through the same horrible cycle of reincarnation. The second watch of the night, he acquired the supreme heavenly eye. Thereupon he looked down upon the entire world, which appeared to him as though reflected in a spotless mirror, and he realized security can be found nowhere in this flood of samsaric existence. So samsara is the cycle of reincarnation. In the third watch of the night drew, the supreme master of trance turned his meditation to the real and essential nature of the world. Alas, living beings wear themselves out in vain over and over again. They are born. So then I'm going to skip down a little bit here, and it says, he passed through the 8 stages of transic insight and quickly reached their highest point. From the summit of the world downwards, he could detect no self anywhere. Like the fire when its fuel is burnt up, he became tranquil. He had reached perfection, and he thought to himself, this is the authentic way on which in the past so many great seers, who also knew all higher and lower things, have traveled on to ultimate and real truth, and now I have obtained it. So he achieved all knowledge in this 8th level of transic insight. And it's just very similar to the Hindu concept of the ether or the akasha, the outermost sphere of the universe, which Plato talks about in the Phaedrus, where the absolute ideas are. which is very similar to people's near-death experiences of rising above their body out towards the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where they experience the past, the present, and the future simultaneously. So that, I think it helps to keep that philosophy in mind when we're going back to the Bodhisattva idea, because the Bodhisattvas get out there to the outermost level of being, but they refrain from exiting the universe, merging back into nirvana, the ocean of Brahman, the Hindus would call it, in which the universes are floating, and they set themselves on helping all other beings achieve enlightenment before they themselves merge. So again, I'm nowhere near an expert in any form of Buddhism. I've read a lot of Buddhist texts, so I'm just trying to get us to compare their idea. The Mahayana Buddhist, does it reinforce or does it weaken the idea of no self? And so going back to the Mahayana Buddhist text, I'm reading now in page 28, the first stage on the left-hand column. The first stage is called the stage of joy. Entering the stage is like passing out of the glare and shadows into a realm of no shadows. So again, keep in mind, we'll be comparing the Bodhisattva idea to Plato's cave allegory, where the prisoner is released from the cave of shadows, sees the sun, realizes that the shadows are just shadows of objects in the outer world, but then he's told to go back down into the cave and help release others. So that's like a bodhisattva. And comparing those two, it's important to keep in mind the first stage of the bodhisattva enlightenment is entering the stages like passing out of the glare and shadows into a realm of no shadows. And then you take these 10 original vows: to honor and serve all Buddhas, to spread the knowledge and practice of the Dharma, to welcome all coming Buddhas, to practice the 6 paramitas, perfections, to persuade all beings to embrace the Dharma, to attain a perfect understanding of the universe, to attain a perfect understanding of the mutuality of all beings, to attain perfect self-realization of the oneness of all the Buddhas and Tathagatas, which means ones who have become that, or self-realized people, and to become acquainted with all skillful means for the carrying out of these vows, for the emancipation of all beings, to realize supreme enlightenment through the perfect self-realization of noble wisdom, ascending the stages and entering Tathagatahood, complete self-realization. So that's the 10 vows that a bodhisattva takes at the first stage, which is passing out of the shadows. And then it skips the next vows, it goes to the 6th. In the spirit of these vows, the bodhisattva gradually ascends the stages to the 6th. All earnest disciples, masters, and arhats have ascended thus far, but being enchanted by the bliss of the samadhis, which are levels of initiation that you can achieve that gives you different flavors of bliss, and not being supported by the powers of the Buddhas, they pass to their nirvana. So in the past, others have, we saw Buddha himself, when he achieved Buddhahood, he realized others have come this way, and now I have achieved it. So there's other Buddhas waiting to greet you when you become a Buddha. And if you just pass into nirvana without deciding to go back and help others achieve enlightenment, then you don't get the support of those previous Buddhas. So the same fate would befall the Bodhisattva, except for the sustaining power of the Buddhas. By that, they are enabled to refuse to enter nirvana until all beings can enter nirvana with them. So they are being encouraged by other self-realized beings who refuse to merge into the impersonal nirvana, and that enables them to resist that temptation of annihilating the self. I'll just read a little bit more here on the right-hand column. The Tathagatas point out to them the virtues of Buddhahood, which are beyond the conception of the intellectual mind, and they encourage and strengthen the bodhisattvas not to give in to the enchantment of the bliss of the samadhis, but to press on to further advancement along the stages. So I'll just skip a little bit here. Strengthened by the new strength that comes to them from the Buddhas, and with the more perfect insight that is theirs by reason of their advance and self-realization of noble wisdom, they re-examine the nature of the mind system the egolessness of personality, and the part that grasping and attachment and habit energy play. In the unfolding drama of life, they re-examine the illusions of the fourfold logical analysis and the various elements that enter into enlightenment and self-realization, and in the thrill of their new power of self-mastery, the Bodhisattva enters upon the seventh stage of far going. Okay, so it seems to me that this resembles Buddha's 8 levels of transic insight. And the outermost one seems to be, he says, from here I look down upon the whole world. So they're seeking perfect understanding of the universe. We saw that for the Hindus, the outermost sphere of the universe itself is the mind of the universe, the universal mind. And that's exactly what we're going to see in stage 8 of the Bodhisattva enlightenment. So the 7th stage is called far going. So supported by the sustaining power of the Buddhas, the Bodhisattvas at this stage enter into the bliss of the samadhi of perfect tranquilization. Owing to their original vows, they are transported by emotions of love and compassion as they become aware of the part they are to perform in carrying out of their vows for the emancipation of all beings. Thus, they do not enter into nirvana, but in truth, they too are already in nirvana, because in their emotions of love and compassion, there is no rising of discrimination. Henceforth, with them, discrimination no more takes place. Because of transcendental intelligence, only one conception is present, the promotion of the realization of noble wisdom. Their insight issues from the womb of Tathagatahood, and they enter into their task with spontaneity and radiancy because it is of the self-nature of noble wisdom. This is called the Bodhisattva's nirvana, the losing oneself in the bliss of perfect self-yielding. This is the 7th stage, the stage of far going. Okay, so they too are already in nirvana because they don't distinguish between themselves and others anymore. They have love and compassion for others, but still, that leads me to believe, so what's the idea here? There's no individual self, but there's one supreme self, and when you realize you're one with that supreme self, then you love everyone else automatically because it's simply self-love? Or is there no self at all? You keep talking about the self-nature of noble wisdom and then saying there's no self. Is there a self? Is there not a self? I know that in the Theravada Buddhist literature, they'd say, the questions of Malunkyaputta to Buddha. He asks questions like that. And then the Buddha says, you asking me questions like that is like someone shot with a poisoned arrow. Rather than letting his friends get a surgeon to remove the arrow, he says, no, first, who shot me? What tribe were they from? What kind of bird did the feathers on the arrow come from? What's the poison made out of? All these are irrelevant questions. Meanwhile, the poison is spreading and they die. Similarly, is there a self? Is there no self? Like I'm asking here, I could see a Buddhist responding with the questions of Malunkyaputta, but this is a very definite scripture about these very definite levels of self-realization, and the very concept of self-realization implies a self. At any rate, let's go on now from the 7th stage of far going, which I'm equating with far going in the universe out to the horizon of the cosmos, or the Akasha. Now the 8th stage, on page 29 at the left-hand column, the 8th stage is the stage of no recession, so you don't return. Up to this stage, because of the defilements upon the face of universal mind caused by the accumulation of habit energy, that's karma, since beginningless time, the mind system and all that pertains to it has been evolved and sustained. The mind system functioned by the discriminations of an external and objective world to which it became attached and by which it was perpetuated. But with the Bodhisattva's attainment of the 8th stage, there comes the turning about within his deepest consciousness from self-centered egoism to universal compassion for all beings, by which he attains perfect self-realization of noble wisdom. So the turning about, that's very similar to Plato's cave allegory, where he says, you're not putting knowledge into people, you need to just turn the eye of the soul inward to see the ideas imprinted on their soul. And the prisoners in the cave, they're chained head to foot, looking at the back of the cave. They need to be turned around and taken out of the cave. So we'll get into that after we go through this Mahayana text. So continuing here, the turning about with his, all right, so there is an instant cessation of the delusive activities of the whole mind system. The dancing of the waves of habit energy on the face of universal mind are forever stilled, revealing its own inherent quietness and solitude, the inconceivable oneness of the womb of Tathagatahood. Henceforth, there is no more looking outward upon an external world by senses and sense mind. So if everything is interwoven at the outermost sphere of the universe, and if you become one with that in this 8th stage of enlightenment, then you don't discriminate between yourself and an exterior objective world anymore, because you're merged with everything. Everything is now one. So thus, establishing himself at the 8th stage of no recession, the Bodhisattva enters into the bliss of the 10 samadhis. He passes through the bliss of the samadhis to assume the transformation body of a Tathagata, that through him all beings may be emancipated. Mahamati, so Buddha's talking, if there had been no Tathagata womb and no divine mind, then there would have been no rising and disappearance of the aggregates that make up personality and its external world. I'm going to skip a little bit. To philosophers, the conception of Tathagata womb seems devoid of purity and soiled by these external manifestations, but it is not so understood by the Tathagatas. To them, it is not a proposition of philosophy, but is an intuitive experience as real as though it was an amalak, a fruit held in the palm of the hand. So, the idea that all the externals are merged and interwoven in this outermost divine mind seems, to some philosophers, to cast impurities on the divine mind. But not so, says Buddha to Mahamati. In the external three-dimensional space unfolding through time, that's the impurity of a dream. But when you see all of those moments occurring simultaneously in their source of the divine mind, then that's purity. It seems to me what he's saying when I'm comparing it to all these other philosophers who say very similar things. Continuing here, thus, when the Bodhisattva arrives at the 8th stage, he's able to see all things truthfully, and more than that, he is able to thoroughly understand the significance of all the dream-like things of his life as to how they came to pass and as to how they pass away. We saw Buddha have that same realization at the first stage of transic insight, when he saw all of his past lives, and that gave him tremendous compassion. I think it should also be noted, I'm going to go back here for a second, and so back to this Anthology of World Religions. At the end of after Buddha achieved enlightenment, the demigods Indra and Brahma approached him, and they said, "Oh, please engender pity in your heart for beings in this world. So varied is their endowment, and while some have much passion, others have only very little. Now that you, O sage, have yourself crossed the ocean of the world of becoming, please rescue also the other living beings who have sunk so deep into suffering. As a generous Lord shares his wealth, so may also you bestow your own virtues on others." So then, in consequence, he was confirmed in his decision to set the world free. So the demigods, Brahma, who creates the material universe, there's a Brahma in each material bubble universe, and Indra, the king of the other demigods under Brahma, they approached him, and then Buddha became a bodhisattva. He came back and spent years wandering India and preaching. So at this, we're on the 8th stage of the Mahayana Bodhisattva realization, and he realizes all this world is a dream. And over on page 30, now in the 8th stage, even the notions have passed away, and all effort and striving is seen to be unnecessary. The Bodhisattva's nirvana is perfect tranquilization, but it is not extinction nor inertness. So the Theravada Buddhists would seem extinction of all sense of individuality is the goal. That's nirvana. The Bodhisattva says, no, that's selfish. Why don't you stick around for a while and try to help everybody else out? Okay. Help help who? Who is there to help? There are no selves. That whole endeavor seems to just reinforce the primal delusion of individual selfhood. I could see a Theravada Buddhist responding. I think the Zen Buddhists that we studied, who scream at each other and beat each other up when they ask each other questions, that seems to be more logically in tune with the Buddhist message of no self. Even grammar itself deludes you into the idea that there are enduring individual things. I walked over to pick up a book. There's the illusion of I, there's the illusion of a book, there are no enduring things. So trying to explain that inherently reinforces the illusion. So rather than explain it, scream at somebody, hit him with a stick. That was what the Zen Buddhists did. The Mahayana Buddhists, it said in the introductory notes, they seem a lot more like Christian virtue, but Christian virtue of selfless love is based on the idea of an eternal self, God, and the individual eternal self that's helping other eternal selves. So that is where the idea of the Bodhisattva and the entire Mahayana interpretation of Buddhism really does put into is there a self or no self? It repeats throughout this text, there is no self, and yet the entire advice seems to pivot on the idea that there is a self, at least temporary selves who need help. And yet you achieve these Buddha forms, these different forms, and I'm going to continue here and you'll see what I'm talking about. So, entering upon the 8th stage, this is page 30, with the turning about at the deepest seat of consciousness, the Bodhisattva will become conscious that he has received the second kind of transcendental body, Mano-mayakaya. So, Mano-mayakaya. The transition from mortal body to transcendental body has nothing to do with mortal death, for the old body continues to function and the old mind serves the needs of the old body, but now it is free from the control of mortal mind. There has been an inconceivable transformation death, by which the false imagination of his particularized individual personality has been transcended by a realization of his oneness with the universalized mind of Tathagatahood, from which realization there will be no recession. So you're no longer identifying with your body and that individual self, but it does seem like now you are identifying with the universal mind of Tathagatahood, which still implies an individual, just a much grander individual. With that realization, he finds himself amply endowed with all the Tathagata powers, psychic faculties, and self-mastery, and just as the good earth is the support of all beings in the world of desire, so the Tathagatas become the support of all beings in the transcendental world of no form. So again, they talk about there's these new bodies and forms, and yet they call it a world of no form. So is this talk of new bodies and levels just metaphor, the only way you can talk to people who haven't achieved enlightenment? You could say that they really are saying it's a void with no self, but they're using language that we can actually understand, because language is inherently all about forms. That's what Plato would teach. So again, this is an intro class to philosophy. So as long as you get the basic idea of, on the one hand, Buddhism says there is no self. On the other hand, the Mahayana Buddhism says that you should dedicate yourself to helping others. And in doing so, you achieve these levels of enlightenment where you achieve these transcendental kinds of forms. So is there a self or is there not? That's the question you need to wrestle with. Does the Mahayana Buddhist philosophy support or weaken the Theravada Buddhist philosophy of no self? So continuing here, the first 7 of the Bodhisattva stages were in the realm of mind, and the 8th, while transcending mind, was still in touch with it. But in the 9th stage of transcendental intelligence, by reason of his perfect intelligence and insight into the imagelessness of divine mind, which he has attained by self-realization of noble wisdom, he is in the realm of Tathagatahood. Gradually, the Bodhisattva will realize his Tathagata nature and the possession of all its powers and psychic faculties. So, transformation bodies and personalities that the Bodhisattva will assume for the sake of benefiting others. That's it. Personalities and forms. Again, it's this back and forth. There is no form, there is a form. There is no self. We're concerned for helping others. The Bodhisattva passes over to all the assemblages of the Buddhas and listens to them as they discourse on the dreamlike nature of all things. So all the previous Buddhas are having a conversation, and when you reach the 9th level of Bodhisattvahood, you can listen in on these conversations. And so they talk about the truths that transcend all notions of being and non-being, that have no relation to birth and death, nor eternality, nor extinction. So there's some level beyond the idea of self and no self that they're interested in that would be impossible for people not at that level to even comprehend. So Thus, facing the Tathagatas as they discourse on noble wisdom that is far beyond the mental capacity of disciples and masters, he will attain 100,000 samadhis. Indeed, 100,000 yutas of kotis of samadhis, which I'm sure means trillions and trillions. And in the spirit of these samadhis, he will instantly pass from one Buddha land to another, paying homage to all the Buddhas, being born into all the celestial mansions, manifesting Buddha bodies, and himself discoursing on the triple treasure to lesser bodhisattvas, that they too may partake of the fruits of self-realization of noble wisdom. So now there's Buddha lands. So in Hinduism, in the Vishnu-worshipping branch of Hinduism, the Vaishnava form, they talk about the spiritual world consists of spiritual planets, each one presided over by a form of Vishnu and Lakshmi, the female side of Vishnu. Here, it seems there's something similar, Buddha lands that are presided over by different Buddhas. So that's the 10th stage. And I'll read this. The passing beyond the last stage of bodhisattvahood, thus passing beyond the last stage of bodhisattvahood, he becomes a Tathagata himself, endowed with all the freedom of the Dharmakaya. The 10th stage belongs to the Tathagatas. Here the bodhisattva will find himself seated upon a lotus-like throne, in a splendid jewel-adorned palace and surrounded by bodhisattvas of equal rank. Buddhas from all the Buddha lands will gather about him, and with their pure and fragrant hands resting on their forehead will give him ordination and recognition as one of themselves. They will assign him a Buddha land that he may possess and perfect as his own. The 10th stage is called the Great Truth Cloud, inconceivable, inscrutable. Only the Tathagatas can realize its perfect imagelessness and oneness and solitude. It is Maheshvara, the radiant land, the pure land, the land of far distances, surrounding and surpassing the lesser worlds of form and desire, in which the Bodhisattva will find himself at one-ment. So, then at the 10th stage, it merges with all the other stages. All right. It surpasses all the Buddha lands and pervades the Akinishta, the highest plane of existence. So maybe at this 10th stage is where the no-self philosophy kicks in, because it transcends all the Buddha lands. As long as there's land, that's individual form. It's not this impersonal ocean of precognitive bliss, which the Hindus would call Brahman. The Buddhists, it seems to me, believe in Brahman. To merge with Brahman is nirvana, the impersonal ocean. But Atman, they reject. Atman is the flip side of Brahman. I've compared that to the particle wave nature of quantum mechanics before. When you observe the waves of probability, they become little particles. When you're not observing them, they merge into these waves of statistical probability for where an individual particle might appear were it to be observed. All right, so I went through the entire 10 stages, or at least the first, and then 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th, and 10th stages of bodhisattvahood. And just keep in mind the questions of King Milinda to the monk Nagasena. There is no self. It's just a bunch of it's a flux of ever-changing sensations. Does the idea of selfless love for others to help them escape suffering reinforce or weaken the idea of no self? All right, so with that now we're going to move on to compare the Bodhisattva to the prisoner in Plato's cave allegory. So let me now turn to that, and that's on page 433 of our book. And so as we went over this for exam 3, the cave allegory is Plato's dialogue, The Republic. He's depicting Socrates talking to Glaucon and Adimantas, who are Plato's half-brothers, about an ideal state. They're creating an ideal society. They're looking for justice in the individual soul. To help themselves, they expand the individual soul to a society. If they can find justice in the bigger pattern, then they can extrapolate back to the smaller pattern of the individual soul. And to help them do this, Socrates invents this allegory, the cave allegory. He says, imagine prisoners chained up head to foot at the moment of birth, taken down into a cave. They're chained up. They're forced to look at the back of the cave. Behind them, above the entrance to the cave, is a blazing fire. In between them and the fire is a raised platform with a wall in front of it. Behind that wall, soldiers or guards walk back and forth carrying puppets up on sticks. So the fire casts the shadow of the puppets on the back wall, but you can't see the guards because of the intermediate wall hiding them. The prisoners naturally think the shadows are reality. The echoes they hear bouncing off the wall, they think that's reality. They see their own shadows and they see the shadows of their neighbors, but they don't see their own three-dimensional form or any others. Then someone comes down, cuts the chains, turns them around. The fire hurts their eyes. They can't see anything. They think the shadows are still real. They're forced out of the cave. They can see things at night, in puddles at night, and then even in day, in the reflections of water, they can see trees and the reflection of the sun. Finally, they can look at the sun itself. And then they realize, oh, this is the source of everything. All right, so I'll read a little bit on page 435, the left-hand column near the bottom. Last of all, he'll be able to see the sun, and not mere reflections of it in the water, but he'll see it in its own proper place and not in another, and he'll contemplate it as it is. Certainly, he'll then proceed to argue that this is what gives the seasons and the years and is the guardian of all that's in the visible world, and in a certain way, the cause of all things he and his fellows have been accustomed to behold. Clearly, okay, and when he remembered his old habitation and the wisdom of the den, that's the cave, and his fellow prisoners, don't you suppose that he'd congratulate himself on the change and pity them? Certainly. And he wouldn't be concerned with their honoring each other for who can predict which shadow will follow which. That's what they pride themselves on. But the prisoner now released will think that it's better to be the poor servant of a poor master than to be the king of Hades, was the rest of the quote that he doesn't talk about. Better to be out of the cave in the worst situation than the most revered prisoner in the cave of shadows. Okay, yes, I think he'd rather suffer anything than entertain these false notions and live in this miserable manner. Imagine once more, I said, such a one coming suddenly out of the sun to be replaced in his old situation. Wouldn't he be certain to have his eyes full of darkness? While his sight was still weak and before his eyes had become steady, and the time which would be needed to acquire this new habit of sight might be very considerable, wouldn't he be ridiculous? Men would say of him that up he went and down he came without his eyes, and that it was better not even to think of ascending. If anyone tried to loose another and lead him up to the light, let them only catch the offender, and they would put him to death. No question, he said. So, this allegory, he says, then Socrates reveals the allegory. The prison house is the world of sight, the light of the fire is the sun, and you won't misapprehend me if you interpret the journey upwards to be the ascent of the soul into the intellectual world, according to my poor belief, which at your desire I have expressed, whether rightly or wrongly, God knows, but whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all, and is seen only with an effort. When seen, it's also inferred to be the universal author of all things beautiful and right, parent of light and of the Lord of light in this visible world, and the immediate source of reason and truth in the intellectual. This is the power upon which he who would act rationally, either in public or private life, must have his eye fixed. That's where our book ends. In the textbook I taught last summer, and for the 5 years prior to that, the Four Fundamental Questions, which is seen its duty in the trenches of the College of Southern Maryland, we had the cave allegory, and it went on and continued for another page. And that's really where you can really see the parallels with the Bodhisattva idea. Even in our textbook, Socrates says, now imagine the prisoner, he's seen the sun and he goes back in the cave, he'd be blinded by the darkness and he wouldn't be able to see the shadows anymore. And the people would want to kill him if he said, you should ascend out of the cave, because they don't want to become blind and insane like this guy. So that's kind of like, that is the idea of a bodhisattva, someone who out of the cave of shadows sees the source of everything, but then returns. And now the parallels with the bodhisattva are a lot more pronounced when you just continue right after where our segment leaves off. So this is back in Four Fundamental Questions. It's page 154 of that book. So, okay, so, but whether true or false, my opinion is that in the world of knowledge, the idea of good appears last of all. All right, that was what we just read. The next paragraph says, moreover, I said, you must not wonder that those who attain to this beatific vision are unwilling to descend to human affairs, for their souls are ever hastening into the upper world where they desire to dwell. which desire of theirs is very natural, if our allegory may be trusted. So, they don't want to return. That's the beatific vision. We saw in the Phaedrus that the soul goes to the outermost horizon of the cosmos, where it perceives all of the absolute ideas, this beautiful realm that it strives so hard to achieve. It's natural once you get there that you don't want to come back. Yes, very natural, says Glaucon. And is there anything surprising in one who passes from divine contemplations to the evil state of man, misbehaving himself in a ridiculous manner, if, while his eyes are blinking and before he has become accustomed to the surrounding darkness, he is compelled to fight in courts of law or in other places about the images or the shadows of images of justice, and is endeavoring to meet the conceptions of those who have never yet seen absolute justice? So once you've seen the absolute ideas, then you have to readjust to the relative mentality of the people who haven't had this beatific vision. And that will be dangerous, because you won't be able to defend yourself very well in the courts, because you're thinking in terms of the absolute ideals and they're thinking in terms of the relative applications of opinion not rooted in absolute knowledge. All right, so he'll be laughed at, he goes on to say. Then at the bottom of page 154, whereas our argument shows that the power and capacity of learning exists in the soul already, and that just as the eye was unable to turn from darkness to light without the whole body, so too the instrument of knowledge, that's the eye of the soul, can only by the movement of the whole soul be turned from the world of becoming into that of being, and learn by degrees to endure the sight of being and the brightest and best of being, in other words, of the good. And he goes, yes. And I pointed out while we were reading the Bodhisattva section about the idea of turning around, and that was one of the levels of Bodhisattva realization, and it's similar to this idea of turning the eye of the soul around. All right, so, and I'll just now skip down to the bottom of page 155. This isn't our book for this semester. This is 4 fundamental questions. He says, then I said, the business of us, who are the founders of the state, will be to compel the best minds to attain that knowledge which we have already shown to be the greatest of all. They must continue to ascend until they arrive at the good, but when they have ascended and seen enough, we must not allow them to do as they do now. What do you mean? I mean that they remain in the upper world, but this must not be allowed. They must be made to descend again among the prisoners in the den and partake of their labors and honors, whether they are worth having or not. But is not this unjust? Ought we to give them a worse life when they might have a better? You have forgotten again, my friend, I said, the intention of the legislator, who did not aim at making any one class in the state happy above the rest. The happiness was to be in the whole state, and he held the citizens together by persuasion and necessity, making them benefactors of the state, and therefore benefactors of one another. To this end he created them, not to please themselves, but to be his instruments in binding up the state. He goes, oh yeah, I forgot. So he says if they hadn't been educated by the state, they wouldn't know anybody anything, and no one could blame them for remaining in the world of blissful realization. But since they had been methodically trained by the state, now they owe it to return and free others. And when they do finally adjust their eyes to the dark cave, when you've acquired the habit, you will see 10,000 times better than the inhabitants of the den, and you will know what the several images are and what they represent, because you have seen the beautiful and just and good in their truth. And he goes on to say, whereas the truth is that the state in which the rulers are most reluctant to govern is always the best and most quietly governed, and the state in which they are most eager, the worst. So the Bodhisattva is supposed to come down and become the philosopher king. That is the famous character from Plato's Republic. So the philosopher king is a lot like the Bodhisattva. The philosopher king gets out of the cave of this three-dimensional universe, sees the absolute ideas at the outermost horizon of the universe, culminating with the idea of the good, opens the eye of the soul to the idea of the good, turns the eye of the soul away from the external things to the universal mind that's imprinted on each individual soul, which is merged with the universal soul, but then comes back down to engage in political affairs in this cave of shadows, at first being bewildered by the darkness, but then accustoming him or herself to the shadows again, can see 10,000 times better. It reminds me of the movie The Matrix. They get out of the computer simulated program, The Matrix. They see, oh, this is reality, but then they go back into the Matrix, but this time they get higher programming and they can do things 10,000 times better than everyone else who's still in the Matrix but hasn't been released. All right, so the questions were part B of exam 4, question 3. Do you think the Mahayana Buddhist ideal of being a Bodhisattva, as described in chapter 1.5, undermines or strengthens the Buddhist philosophy of no self, described in chapter 7 and 8? Explain. And number 4, how is a Bodhisattva similar to the prisoner in Plato's cave allegory who has seen the sun? All right, we've covered that, I think, thoroughly enough. In the next video, I'll be going over Plato's Republic again. Actually, in the next video, I'll be going over the Tao Te Ching. So we'll leave it at that.